Welcome back to the Biochemistry for Health Sciences channel. In today's video, we shall talk about these two hormones, ghrelin as well as leptin. You might be wondering, why do we have so many videos on feeding and starvation? We had almost about 30 videos on metabolism and about 15 or so videos on regulation of metabolism. And this is because feeding and starvation is related to food, and food is the fuel that our body uses to generate energy. Energy generation is done by burning fuel in the presence or absence of oxygen. Now, we humans do not store energy. Most of the energy is used in the form of a chemical called ATP, as mentioned in previous videos. We do not store ATP. We do, however, store fuel, and we have limited oxygen storage, especially in skeletal muscles. Since we do not store ATP, this means that all our cells, all our 30 trillion cells in an adult, must be able to generate energy at all times. Like everything else in the body, too much energy is as bad as too little energy. One of the most important clinical implications of energy balance is this medical condition that we call obesity. Now, obesity is a very serious medical condition that is caused by impaired energy balance. Unfortunately, obesity is very common. About 40% of the population in the US are considered obese. Worldwide, we are talking about approximately 1 billion people. Obesity is related to increased risk of several diseases. And these examples of some of these diseases include cardiovascular disease, type 2 diabetes, metabolic syndrome where there is excess body fat in the waist, high blood cholesterol levels, as well as hyperglycemia, as well as high blood pressure. And then diseases such as cancer, musculoskeletal disorders such as arthritis, respiratory diseases such as asthma, renal diseases, even mental diseases have been associated with obesity. We discussed several hormones that are involved in energy balance. Insulin was discussed in videos 6.8 to 6.11. Glucagon was covered in 6.12 and 6.13. 6.14, we discussed the catecholamines, cortisol, and growth hormone, and we touched upon thyroid hormones. And in this video, we shall look at ghrelin and leptin and their role in energy balance. Ghrelin is the hormone that stimulates hunger, stimulates our appetite, and that will make us eat in order to generate energy. Leptin, on the other hand, tells the body that we are full. So it inhibits appetite so that we do not continuously eat. And in this respect, both these hormones play a role in optimizing energy balance. Let's look at ghrelin first. Ghrelin basically affects almost the entire body. That includes cardiovascular system, the bone, muscle, the nervous system, including sensation like pain, smell, taste, motor functions, memory and learning, immune system, respiratory system, renal system, reproductive system, as well as endocrine system. However, in this video we shall focus on two effects of ghrelin. One is in energy balance, how it promotes hunger by affecting the hypothalamus. The second effect we'll talk about is the role of ghrelin in promoting the secretion of growth hormone by the pituitary gland. Ghrelin is synthesized mostly by the PD-1 cells in the stomach. During the synthesis, pre-progrelin, which has 117 amino acids and consists of the signal peptide as well as the ghrelin part and the obestatin part, is processed and the signal is removed in order to give us progrelin, which is about 94 amino acids, and that contains the ghrelin part and the obestatin part. In the next step, a fatty acid, caprylic acid, is attached to progrelin, and that gives us octinoylated progrelin. So we basically have progrelin that has a fatty acid attached to it. This reaction is catalyzed by the enzyme called Ghrelin O-acyl transferase, or abbreviated as GOAT. The octinoylated progrelin is then acted on by the enzyme PC13 prohormone convertase to give us the active acylated ghrelin that has 28 amino acids and the obestatin part that has 23 amino acids. This active ghrelin is then secreted by the PD-1 cells into the bloodstream. The plasma concentration of ghrelin peaks before food intake and decreases back to normal approximately after 1 hour eating. So this active ghrelin will travel to different tissues and carry out its effects on the body. Eventually it is broken down into ghrelin. The C8 part is removed, and then this ghrelin is further broken down into smaller peptides which are excreted by the kidney. So how is ghrelin regulated? Stimulation of ghrelin happens when the stomach is empty, and there are also several other factors, examples of chemicals that stimulate ghrelin secretion include the catecholamines, acetylcholine, cortisol, as well as glucagon, especially when norepinephrine is present. The secretion of ghrelin is inhibited by the presence of food in the GI system, for example, food in the stomach as well as the duodenum. Stomach distension may be partly responsible for ghrelin inhibition, although by itself it doesn't inhibit ghrelin, as recent studies show. There are also several chemicals that can inhibit ghrelin secretion, and that includes growth hormone, somatostatin, insulin, IGF-1, as well as leptin. A few words about ghrelin signaling. So when ghrelin is released into the bloodstream by the PD-1 cells of the stomach, the ghrelin will bind receptors on target cells, and this receptor is called growth hormone secretory receptor, GHSR, and this receptor is a GPCR, a G protein coupled receptor. Binding of the ghrelin to the receptor leads to the activation of several G proteins that are associated with this receptor. For example, in pancreatic cells, the G protein G-alpha IO is activated. This protein will go and inhibit the enzyme adenyl cyclase, and when this enzyme is inhibited, there will be decreased concentration of cyclic AMP, and when there's decreased concentration of cyclic AMP, that will lead to decreased insulin production and secretion by the pancreas. So in this way, ghrelin can inhibit insulin secretion by the pancreas. In the hypothalamus, ghrelin leads to the secretion of NPY and AGRP. These are chemicals that promote appetite. So in this case, the binding of ghrelin to the receptor stimulates this G protein called G-alpha Q11, and this protein then goes on to activate the enzyme phospholipase C. This enzyme phospholipase C catalyzes the breakdown of phosphatidyl inositol bisphosphate or PIP2 into IP3 as well as DAG. This increase in IP3 will lead to the IP3 binding and opening calcium channels in the endoplasmic reticulum. And when these channels are open, calcium comes out into the cytoplasm. This increased calcium will go and bind a protein called CAMKKB or calcium calmodulin dependent protein kinase B, and this protein activation will lead to the activation of the enzyme AMP kinase. And when AMPK is activated, that will cause the hypothalamus to release the appetite chemicals NPY, AGRP, and that will increase our appetite. In case of the pituitary cells, the increased calcium will lead to the release of growth hormone by the pituitary gland. Ghrelin also stimulates cell growth as well as proliferation as well as cell survival, and that is partly done by this DAG, which will activate protein kinase C that then goes on to stimulate this signal transduction pathway involving REF, RES, MEK, and MEPK. And this pathway basically will stimulate the growth of cells, cell proliferation, as well as survival. So it's really incredible that this hormone that is produced by the stomach goes on to do so many different effects in the human body. So let's see how ghrelin promotes hunger, and then we'll look at how ghrelin stimulates the release of growth hormone. First, how ghrelin promotes hunger. In the arcuate nucleus part of the hypothalamus, we have these neurons called pro-opiomelanocortin neurons or POMC neurons. Now these POMC neurons secrete this chemical alpha acids. Alpha acids will bind to neurons present in the paraventricular nucleus of the hypothalamus. The alpha acids basically binds these receptors called melanocortin 4 receptors or MC4R, and that will activate these neurons, leading to the feeling of satiety, fullness. So basically, this is how we suppress our appetite by this is one way we suppress our appetite, by the POMC neurons. Now when ghrelin is released by the stomach, ghrelin will bind the G8SR receptors, these G8SR receptors here, which are present on these neurons called the neuropeptide Y, a Gauty-related peptide neuron, or NPY-AGRP neurons that are present in the arcuate nucleus. So when ghrelin binds these receptors on these NPY-AGRP neurons, this will cause these neurons to release gamma-aminobutyric acid, or GABA. Now GABA released by these neurons will then bind GABA receptors on the POMC neurons and inhibit the POMC neurons. And now the POMC neurons will not secrete alpha MSH, and therefore we will not have this feeling of fullness, which means we are going to be hungry. So this is one way by which ghrelin can stimulate hunger. Another way by which ghrelin can stimulate hunger is when ghrelin binds to the NPY-AGRP neurons. That will activate these neurons, and they will start secreting these two chemicals, AGRP, which is a Gauty-related peptide, as well as NPY, which is neuropeptide Y. Both of these chemicals, AGRP as well as NPY, these are orexigenic chemicals, or basically appetite stimulants. AGRP will inhibit the binding of alpha MSH to MC4R. So by inhibiting this binding, there is no appetite suppression, so basically it promotes hunger. So that's how AGRP promotes hunger. NPY, neuropeptide Y, will bind these Y15R receptors on these neurons present in the paraventricular nucleus of the hypothalamus, and that will promote hunger once again. So both these chemicals will promote hunger when ghrelin binds to the NPY-AGRP neurons, which releases NPY as well as AGRP. Another effect of ghrelin on the brain is that ghrelin stimulates dopaminergic neurons that are present in various parts of the brain, especially the ventral tegmental area of the brainstem. And when these neurons are stimulated, they release dopamine, or DA. The dopamine will then go to various pleasure reward centers of the brain. Examples of these pleasure reward centers include the nucleus accumbens, the hippocampus, prefrontal cortex of the brain, as well as the amygdala. And when DA, dopamine, goes to these pleasure reward centers, what happens is it will stimulate the feeding process. It will stimulate our appetite, and we will start eating. Now let's see how ghrelin stimulates the secretion of growth hormone by the pituitary gland. There are several ways by which ghrelin can stimulate the pituitary gland to increase its secretion of growth hormone. One is ghrelin will go to the hypothalamus and stimulate the release of GHRH, and this GHRH will then stimulate the release of growth hormone by the pituitary gland. Another way is a direct effect on the pituitary gland. So ghrelin will stimulate the pituitary gland, and the gland will start secreting more growth hormone. Another way by which ghrelin causes or stimulates the release of growth hormone by the pituitary gland is by inhibiting the secretion of IGF-1 by the liver. Ghrelin inhibits IGF-1 secretion by the liver. Now, IGF-1 has several effects on the brain. So one is that IGF-1 inhibits growth hormone secretion by the pituitary gland. So by inhibiting IGF-1, ghrelin removes this inhibition, which means ghrelin will stimulate the secretion of GH by the pituitary gland. Now, another effect of IGF-1 is that it stimulates the release of somatostatin by the periventricular nucleus of the hypothalamus. So when somatostatin is released, somatostatin has two important effects. One is that it inhibits the release of GHRH. The second, and this GHRH is of course coming from the hypothalamus. The second is somatostatin inhibits the release of GH by the pituitary gland. So by ghrelin inhibiting IGF-1, this stimulation stops. SS is not released in high amounts anymore. This inhibition is stopped. GHRH is released, that stimulates GH secretion. This inhibition is stopped, and the pituitary starts secreting more GH. So through these several mechanisms, ghrelin will stimulate the release of growth hormone by the pituitary gland. Now let's look at the second hormone, leptin. Like ghrelin, leptin affects almost every body system. The major ones that have been reported do include like reproductive effects on bone, as well as immune function, but we shall focus on the effects of leptin on energy balance. So basically, leptin will increase energy expenditure. For example, it may promote the release of heat by thermogenesis. Leptin is mostly synthesized by adipocytes. The leptin gene is on chromosome 7. This gene is transcribed and then translated to form the protein leptin, which has about 167 amino acids. This protein then is secreted by the adipocytes into the bloodstream. In the bloodstream, the protein exists as a bound form. It is bound to a protein called the soluble leptin receptor, or SOBR, and of course there is some in the free form. So this free form would be the active form. The amount of leptin present in the bloodstream is proportional to the amount of fat present in the body. Regulation of leptin secretion, stimulation is done by the presence of food in the stomach, as well as by insulin. Interesting, so leptin regulation is carried out by insulin, while leptin itself then inhibits insulin secretion, and that relationship is shown here. So you can see the adipocytes releasing leptin, and leptin inhibits insulin secretion by the beta cells of the pancreas, while insulin itself activates or stimulates leptin secretion. Corticosteroids are also hormones that stimulate leptin secretion. Another major stimulant of leptin secretion are these cytokines, the inflammatory cytokines such as tumor necrosis factor alpha or TNF alpha. Inhibition of leptin secretion happens when the stomach is empty. It's also carried out by growth hormone. The catecholamines as well as the thyroid hormones also inhibit leptin secretion. A few words about leptin signaling. The leptin receptor, LEPR, is a receptor without intrinsic tyrosine kinase activity. And we'll talk more about these receptors and cell signaling in future videos. So this is a class 1 cytokine receptor. So when leptin binds to the leptin receptor, so the first step would be leptin binding to a leptin receptor. So unlike the insulin receptor, this receptor does not have tyrosine kinase activity. However, when it is bound by leptin, the receptor attracts a tyrosine kinase called Janus kinase 2 or JAK2. So JAK2 is attracted to the receptor when the signal leptin is bound to the receptor. This tyrosine kinase, JAK2, then will phosphorylate the receptor, and this phosphorylated receptor will now be a place where several proteins will be recruited and phosphorylated. So examples of these proteins include ST80, which is signal transducer and activator of transcription, ST80, as well as several other proteins such as suppressor of cytokine signaling, SOCS, and so on. The recruitment of all of these proteins to the receptor then will trigger several pathways. So for example, the JAK-STAT pathway, signal transduction pathway, is triggered. The PI3K or phosphoinositol 3 kinase pathway would be triggered. The ERK or the mitogen activated protein kinase extracellular signal regulated kinase, MAPK ERK pathways, these will be triggered, and several other pathways will be triggered, and the end results of all these pathways would be the expression of several genes in the DNA in the nucleus of the target cell. A few words about the association of leptin and inflammation. Leptin promotes inflammation. So remember, leptin comes from the fat tissue, the adipose tissue, produces leptin. And this leptin then actually triggers the immune cells to release the inflammatory cytokines, such as TNF alpha that we mentioned, interleukin 6, interleukin 12, and so on. And these cytokines in turn will activate or stimulate the release of leptin by the adipose tissue. Now, inflammation is an underlying cause for several chronic diseases. So since leptin promotes inflammation, and adipose tissue produces leptin, this may help explain the association between obesity and several of the chronic diseases that we mentioned earlier that are associated with obesity. How does leptin promote satiety or feeling fullness? Let's look at this. So one way by which leptin suppresses appetite is that leptin binds the leptin receptors that are present on the POMC neurons that are present in the arcuate nucleus of the hypothalamus. This binding of leptin to the POMC neurons will cause increased synthesis and secretion of alpha MSH. So these neurons start releasing alpha MSH, and this alpha MSH will then go bind the MC4R receptors that are present in the neurons of the paraventricular nucleus of the hypothalamus. Activation of these PVN neurons will then lead to suppression of appetite or satiety. Leptin also binds the leptin receptors on these NPY-AGRP neurons. Remember, these are neurons that promote hunger. So by inhibiting these neurons, NPY is not secreted, and that leads to satiety or suppression of appetite. Now, leptin resistance is one of the many causes of obesity. So what is leptin resistance? Leptin resistance is the impaired brain response to leptin. Basically, either leptin is unable to reach the target cells in the brain, or there are reduced number of leptin receptors, or there is some sort of problem with leptin signaling. So due to leptin resistance, there is no suppression of appetite, and the person will continue eating in spite of having more than enough fat stores, and that will lead to obesity, which means more adipose tissue. More adipose tissue means more leptin levels, higher leptin levels in the blood, and that once again will lead to this vicious cycle leading to obesity. As mentioned earlier, obesity is a very important medical condition. The causes of obesity are many and they are very complex. One is the energy imbalance. The calorie intake exceeds the energy expenditure. This is related to, for example, eating high-calorie diets, eating large portion sizes, snacking, as well as inadequate physical activity. And of course, genetics is one of the causes or associations with obesity. And then there are other causes such as environmental factors. There may be limited access to healthy foods. There is marketing of unhealthy food choices. And of course, then we have medical conditions such as hypothyroidism, and there are certain medications that can cause obesity. So this is the effect of ghrelin, the hormone discovered in 1999, as well as leptin, which was discovered in 1994, on this very important energy balance for the body. So until the next video, thank you very much for watching. Have a wonderful day, and we'll see you soon.